What if the biggest problem with David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy is ultimately people thought these movies were expected these movies to all be the same? This is a question I have often asked myself when discussing and talking about these films, and so today I would like to do a David Gordon Green Halloween trilogy retrospective. When Halloween 2018 released, audiences were mostly on board. It was stripped down, brutal, and felt like a genuine continuation of John Carpenter's 1978 classic. But as the trilogy continued with Halloween Kills and especially Halloween Ends, the reactions became more hostile, more divided, and honestly, more fascinating. Because whether you loved these movies or hated them, I don't think they were ever trying to tell the story that people thought they were. Now, don't get me wrong, this trilogy does have issues, and as a fan and a film lover, I can't just turn a blind eye to these things. Is there jokes that don't land? Absolutely. Is there characters that feel extremely underutilized? Yes. Is there dialogue that is repeated to the point of almost parody in these films?
Evil dies tonight!
Evil dies tonight!
All right.
Yes. But honestly, this trilogy really isn't about Michael. Or at least, not entirely. Ultimately, what I think this trilogy is trying to tackle is trauma. How trauma can fester if it's left unchecked, how it spreads, and how even entire families and entire towns can just be completely consumed by how trauma can warp your reality. Each film, to me, represents three different stages of trauma. Halloween 2018, to me, is all about survival. Halloween Kills is all about obsession and hysteria, and ultimately Halloween Ends is about inheritance. That's why this trilogy becomes more divisive as it goes on. The further away it moves from being a traditional or your traditional version of a slasher, the more audiences became polarized to it. But I genuinely think there is a very interesting story that is being told throughout all three movies, especially Halloween Ends, which I personally believe is the most misunderstood movie of this entire trilogy ever since its release back in 2022. Now I want to make it abundantly clear before we even get started, really. I am not trying to change your perspective or your view on these movies. If you just objectively don't like them, that's fine. More power to you. You are allowed to have your own opinion on films. I am not going to try to force you to believe what I think. This is just my interpretation of how this trilogy may have been designed and what I pulled away from it. I am not here to claim that it's perfect, and I am definitely not here to claim that any of the criticisms are not valid, and maybe perhaps to make a case of why this trilogy maybe deserves a different conversation. So today, I want to do a David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy retrospective. To really understand why this trilogy became so divisive, I think one part is you have to first understand where the franchise was before David Gordon Green ever even touched it. By the time Halloween 2018 was announced, this series had already been rebooted, retconned, and rebooted again and buried under decades of conflicting timelines. After the mixed reception of Rob Zombie's Halloween 2 in 2009, the franchise essentially just disappeared for nearly a decade. There was a Halloween 3D, which was a sequel to Rob Zombie's other two Halloween films that never really got off the ground because of rights issues. Then later, there was a Halloween Returns, which was proposed to be a reboot that would have taken the series back to a more stripped-down, atmospheric approach. Scripts were written, directors were even attached to it. Concept art even circulated online for quite a few years, and then it quietly disappeared as well. How is it that one of the most popular slashers of all time had gotten itself into this situation? The franchise had become trapped between nostalgia, reinvention, constantly restarting itself without ever really figuring out what it wanted to say. At that point, Halloween felt creatively stuck, and eventually went as quiet as the shape himself. So when Blumhouse announced that David Gordon Green and Danny McBride would be creating a direct sequel to John Carpenter's original film, completely ignoring every other sequel in the franchise, it immediately grabbed people's attention for better or worse. especially because this wasn't a direction anyone expected. David Gordon Green wasn't really known for horror. Danny McBride definitely wasn't known for horror. And yet somehow that unusual creative team ended up making the most financially successful Halloween film of all time. But success creates expectations, and I think those expectations play a huge part of why the conversation around this entire trilogy changed so dramatically over the next 4 years.
Happy Halloween, Michael.
You know, in all honesty, that pressure is probably what makes Halloween 2018 so interesting to revisit now. Because the movie had an almost impossible job. It needed to honor one of the most beloved horror films ever made, ignore 40 years of complicated continuity, reintroduce Michael Myers to a modern audience, and somehow justify bringing Laurie Strode back into the story for the second time without feeling like pure nostalgia bait. And against all odds, it mostly worked. When audiences walked into theaters in 2018, there was this immediate feeling that Halloween, the legendary slasher franchise, finally was back. It finally felt serious again. And the mask was by far the best looking mask that we had had since the original film. It looked almost exactly like a weathered version of the original 78 mask that had been decaying for over 40 years. One thing that this entire trilogy deserves so much more credit for is the cinematography and the camera work. Halloween 2018 absolutely understands that Michael Myers is at his most terrifying when he feels present within the environment. Not just when he suddenly appears for a jump scare, not just a loud boom to get the audience to jump. There is multiple movements throughout this entire film where the camera just quietly follows Michael as he glides like a shape through Haddonfield, almost as if we're drifting alongside him. These scenes feel so heavily inspired by John Carpenter's original use of widescreen compositions and lingering tension. But of course, the absolute standout example of this is obviously this long one-take sequence following Michael through the quiet neighborhood of Haddonfield on Halloween night. And honestly, I still think that this is one of the best scenes in the entire trilogy. I would go out as far as to say that this is one of the best scenes in any single Halloween movie ever made. The camera slowly glides behind him as he moves house to house, murder to murder, without cutting away. There's no flashy editing trying to manufacture tension. The horror strictly comes from the casualness of it. Michael doesn't feel like a movie monster in this scene. He feels inevitable. The shape, the ever-growing boogeyman. The violence felt so raw and ugly instead of stylized. And most importantly, the film understood something that a lot of the sequels forgot. Michael Myers is absolutely scarier when the movie refuses to fully explain him. That simplicity is what made the original 1978 film work so incredibly well, and David Gordon Green, in my opinion, clearly understood this. But what I think Halloween 2018 resonates beyond just nostalgia is Laurie Strode. Because this version of Laurie isn't presented as a triumphant legacy hero at first. She's isolated, paranoid, emotionally trapped in 1978. The movie really asks an interesting question here. What happens when somebody survives evil, but can never actually escape it? And that's where this trilogy's larger theme of generational trauma really begins. Laurie's fear didn't end with her. It spread. It spread into her family. Karen, her daughter, grew up under survivalist paranoia. Allison inherited the emotional fallout of growing up between two generations, constantly in conflict with each other. Trauma becomes hereditary in these movies, passed down almost like a curse. In Halloween 2018, trauma is the beating heart of the story. Laurie Strode survived Michael Myers in 1978, but we find her 40 years later as a prisoner of her own making. Her home is a fortress, her relationships are fractured, and her identity is consumed, preparing for a threat no one else believes will return. The film shows us how trauma isolates her. She's estranged from her daughter Karen, who resents her growing up in a state of constant fear. Laurie's trauma isn't just a memory, it's a legacy. The bunker under her house, the mannequin she uses for target practice, these are all manifestations of a life defined by a single horrific night. And then there's Karen, who grew up with a mother who taught her to shoot before she was 10. That's the generational echo. Karen tries to move past her mother's paranoia, but it's always there. And Allison, Laurie's granddaughter, is caught between these two worlds, wanting to connect to the grandmother, Laurie, but raised to believe her grandmother was paranoid. The film makes clear that trauma doesn't end with survival. It festers, it changes shape, and spreads through family dynamics, passed down from generation to generation. Halloween 2018 is the first chapter in exploring how trauma roots run deep, and that's only the beginning of what this trilogy is trying to say. And I think that thematic foundation is a huge reason why Halloween 2018 initially connected with so many people. Underneath the slasher framework, there's a very human story about fear and trauma, consuming someone's entire identity. Now, obviously, the movie isn't without flaws. Even people who love Halloween 2018, like myself, usually admit that some of the comedy can feel very misplaced. There's some jokes that just do not land, and sometimes it can feel very tonally inconsistent. That's extremely valid. There are absolute moments where the tension gets interrupted by jokes that don't entirely fit the tone of the film that it's trying to build. But honestly, I think that lighter tone is partially why the movie succeeded with the mainstream audience in the first place. It made the film feel more accessible, crowd-pleasing, safer. And that word safe is very important, because I think the reaction to Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends becomes much easier to understand once you realize audiences expected the trilogy to continue this exact direction. But David Gordon Green clearly had something much messier and much more experimental in his mind.
Hey, Michael. It's Halloween. Everyone's entitled to one good scare.
With the box office hit that Halloween 2018 was, it was only natural that a sequel was going to happen. Now, what's important to remember is that Halloween 2018 was originally designed to be a standalone film. No, there was no plans to make another Halloween film after Halloween 2018. But the idea of a trilogy wasn't completely locked in until the first film proved its success at the box office. And once it did, the creative team had to ask themselves, where do we go next? And Halloween Kills took a sharp turn. Halloween Kills was originally slated to release October 16th of 2020, following its completed filming in 2019. But unfortunately, due to the ongoing pandemic, it was eventually delayed until October 15th of 2021. Now, before we get lost in the chaos of Halloween Kills, the film starts off by grounding us right where we left off in the previous film. Cameron, which is Allison's boyfriend, which is now her ex, finds Deputy Hawkins bleeding out in the road. This is a direct link to the final confrontation of the previous film. But then, right as the movie is getting us right back into the mood that is Halloween 2018, it takes a step back, a big step back, right into a flashback straight back to the original 1978. And I think many would agree that this flashback sequence, meticulously recreating the atmosphere of John Carpenter's original film, is not only one of the best parts of this film, but is one of the best scenes of any Halloween movie since that original film. This not only gives us more insight into Hawkins' past, but brings us right back to that crisp, eerie feeling of the first Halloween film. This absolutely sets the bar and the mood before the real carnage even begins. I can tell you, as a Halloween fan, seeing this flashback meticulously recreate that 1978 film the way it did, and having a recreation of Dr. Loomis, while it's not exactly spot on, it is very close. This was an absolute treat to watch in the theater back in 2021. As we finish the intro to this hauntingly beautiful score that John Carpenter and his sons created, we then cut exactly to where Halloween 2018 leaves us off. Laurie, Karen, and Allison, wounded but alive, riding away from Laurie's burning house, believing that they finally put an end to Michael Myers and their 40-year-long nightmare. But this film is called Halloween Kills for a reason. Halloween Kills doesn't give them or us any time to breathe. Instead, it plunges us right back into the chaos of that same night. And this time, it isn't just about Laurie's fight, it's about Haddonfield's. Because instead of making just another restrained, grounded continuation of Halloween 2018, David Gordon Green took the exact opposite approach this time. Halloween Kills hits you with a bang right off the bat. It is louder, messier, meaner, and even more chaotic than the last film. The first big set piece of this film that we get is the firefighters on their way to go to Laurie's house, bypassing Laurie as they're riding in the back of the truck, presuming that they're safe. As they see the fire trucks riding by, they scream and cry to let it burn. Let him burn. We then cut to the firefighters attempting to put out the massive fire that is at Laurie's old house. As these firefighters proceed into the house, the floor collapses beneath them, trapping one of them in the basement. This is where we find a scorched Michael Myers, who had hidden himself away inside of Laurie's weapon locker. Halloween Kills is called Halloween Kills for a reason. This film has the highest body count amongst any single other Halloween film in the entire franchise. As we dive into Halloween Kills, one thing is absolutely undeniable. This film does not hold back. In fact, it is the most brutal entry in the entire franchise. It racks up the highest body count, and the violence is more visceral and more unflinching than it ever has been. The kills are more drawn out, messier, and even more deliberately shocking. If Halloween 2018 was brutal in its realism, then Kills amplifies the gore to almost operatic levels. For some, this is a little too much. For others, it's exactly what a movie called Halloween Kills promised. I think a lot of people walked into this movie expecting Halloween 2018 Part 2 when that never really was what it wanted to be. If Halloween 2018 is about personal trauma, then Halloween Kills is about communal trauma. The fear has spread beyond Laurie Strode now. Michael Myers has infected the entire town of Haddonfield, and I think that is actually a really interesting idea. Because throughout the movie, Haddonfield almost feels less like a real town and more like a pressure cooker ready to explode. Everybody is angry, everybody is scared, and everybody wants revenge. The film constantly emphasizes how decades of fear and mythology surrounding Michael Myers have transformed him into something larger than a man in the minds of the townspeople. Which brings us to the movie's most infamous line.
Evil dies tonight! Evil dies tonight!
Evil dies tonight. And look, yes, the movie absolutely overuses it. Even people who defend Halloween Kills usually acknowledge that the repetition becomes almost comical after a certain point. The dialogue starts feeling less natural and more like the movie's hammering its themes a little too directly at the audience. But I think the line's repetitiveness is partly the point. Mob mentality thrives on slogans. People repeat phrases until emotion overrides thought, and that's exactly what happens throughout this film. The hospital sequence is probably the clearest example of this. Fear completely consumes rationality. The crowd becomes more dangerous than the thing they're even chasing. And honestly, I think that sequence has aged a little bit better for me now than it did on release, because it feels disturbingly relevant to how panic spreads in real life. Rumors become truth, emotions become certainty, and crowds stop thinking as individuals. In Halloween Kills, the theme of trauma expands from the personal to the collective. Laurie's trauma was individual. Now, Haddonfield's entire history is haunted. The town, like Laurie, has never really truly moved on. We see this as old characters return, like Tommy Doyle and Lindsay Wallace, each still scarred from that night back in 1978. But the film asks, what happens when fear isn't processed, but instead is passed down? Like I mentioned earlier, the entire town becomes like a pressure cooker, a mob fueled by 4 decades of unresolved fear. Evil Dies Tonight becomes their battle cry, but it's more than just a line. It's a reflection of how the community's desperation to control their trauma and its result into chaos. Haddonfield's trauma morphs into paranoia, and in their frenzy, they become as dangerous as the monster they so greatly fear. Halloween Kills says that when trauma is left to simmer, it doesn't just destroy individuals, it can tear apart even whole communities. Now, does the movie always execute those ideas perfectly? Absolutely not. There are definitely moments where Halloween Kills feels caught between being a brutal slasher film and a larger social commentary. Some characters feel underdeveloped despite the massive ensemble cast, and bringing back legacy characters from Halloween 2 creates expectations that the movie doesn't always fully satisfy. Tommy Doyle especially feels like a character with a huge thematic potential that the film never quite knows how to fully utilize. And then there's Laurie Strode, which is probably the criticism I do agree with the most. After how central Laurie was in Halloween 2018, sidelining her to a hospital bed, which is basically repeating the original Halloween 2, for most of the movie feels understandably frustrating to most people, including myself. Especially because the marketing heavily implied that there would be another direct Laurie versus Michael confrontation. But, interestingly, I think Laurie's physical absence is actually intentional from a thematic perspective. Now look, I can already hear you going to the comments. You just agreed with the criticism about that, but I would really like to dive into that just a little bit more, so just hear me out on this. Because Halloween Kills is the moment where the story stops being only about Laurie's trauma. Now, the entire town is infected by it. Michael Myers barely even feels like a person in this movie anymore. He becomes almost mythological. Less the shape and more an embodiment of fear itself. Every murder escalates the hysteria around him until the town practically destroys itself trying to fight him. And whether you think the movie succeeds or fails, I do respect how unapologetically excessive it is. This absolutely isn't a restrained slow burn. It is a nightmare spiral. An entire town, an entire community collapsing under decades of unresolved fear and anger. Which is exactly why I think Halloween Ends ended up being such a shocking follow-up. Because instead of escalating things even further, it suddenly becomes something completely different. Now, before we even get into Halloween Ends, I think it's important to remember what the atmosphere around Halloween Ends was like. Because this movie walked into theaters carrying an enormous amount of expectation. This wasn't being marketed as just another sequel. Universal marketed it as the conclusion, the final confrontation between Laurie Strode and Michael Myers after more than 40 years of history. And because of that, audiences walked in expecting something very specific. They expected escalation, a massive final showdown, a direct continuation of the chaos from the ending of Halloween Kills. But almost immediately after release, it became very clear that Halloween Ends was going to split audiences right down the middle. Critically, the response was pretty mixed. The film currently sits around a 40% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes, with audience reactions being just as divisive. And honestly, if you go back and look at the reactions from October 2022, a lot of the backlash feels less like disappointment over execution and more like the audience is rejecting the movie the second they realized it wasn't the movie they had imagined in their heads. The biggest criticism kept repeating itself everywhere. Where is Michael Myers? And to be fair, I understand that reaction. Michael is surprisingly absent for a large portion of this film, especially compared to Halloween Kills, where he was practically unstoppable. Instead, the movie introduces us to Corey Cunningham as a new central figure, shifting focus away from the traditional Laurie versus Michael dynamic people had expected the trilogy to end on. For fans, that felt almost sacrilegious. You can even see it reflected in the audience discussions at the time, where people described the film as not a real Halloween movie because of how much it deviated from the expected formula. What's interesting though, is that financially the movie still opened pretty strong. Despite the mixed reviews and the divisive audience reaction, Halloween Ends debuted at #1 at the box office with over $40 million opening weekend. And this was while it was simultaneously releasing on Peacock at the exact same time. But then came the massive second week drop. Word was out, Michael isn't in the movie as much. We have a new character that people don't really know and maybe don't like. And I think that drop tells the story better than any Rotten Tomatoes score ever could. The movie had huge curiosity. People wanted to see this trilogy ended. But once audiences realized that the film was taking a slower, stranger, more thematic approach instead of delivering the non-stop Michael Myers carnage that we got from the previous film, word of mouth became incredibly polarized. And honestly, I think that reaction is exactly why Halloween Ends is worth talking about all these years later. Because love it or hate it, this movie didn't fail because it was safe. It failed or succeeded depending on who you ask, because it took one of the biggest creative swings in the final film of a new trilogy.
You came here to kill me, so do it.
Halloween Ends released on October 14th, 2022 as the most divisive film of the trilogy, maybe one of the most divisive films of the entire franchise. And in all honesty, I think a large part of that reaction comes from the fact that Halloween Ends is not interested in giving audiences the movie they thought they were going to get. After Halloween Kills, most people expected escalation. A full 2-hour Laurie versus Michael showdown, the ultimate confrontation, the Shape versus the final girl that got away. And instead, Halloween Ends does something far stranger. It asks, what happens after the hysteria fades? Because unlike the previous two films, Ends takes its first big swing as it makes a 4-year time jump. Michael Myers has vanished, the chaos of that night has settled into something quieter, but not healthier. Haddonfield is still traumatized, still angry, still looking for someone to blame, and that's where Corey Cunningham comes in. Corey isn't just a random new character inserted into the franchise for no reason. He is the thematic culmination of everything this trilogy has been building towards since 2018. If Halloween 2018 is about surviving trauma, and Halloween Kills is about communities consumed by that trauma, then Halloween Ends is about becoming the trauma. Corey is a young man destroyed by one tragic accident, but what truly transforms him isn't just the event itself, it's the way Haddonfield responds to him after it. The town projects its own fear and bitterness onto him until he slowly begins to internalize the role that they have created for him. Haddonfield is still reeling from the events of 4 years ago. Michael Myers returned 40 years later, wreaked havoc again, and slaughtered so many innocent people, including Laurie's own daughter. They're also bitter and paranoid. They need someone to point a finger at, to direct all of this anger and this hatred towards. That's why I've always found the reaction to Corey so interesting, because people often criticize him by saying, that doesn't feel like a Michael Myers story. But I actually think that that's kind of the point. Michael barely even functions as a normal human being anymore in this trilogy, and by the time we reach Halloween Ends, he's become mythological, an infection lingering underneath Haddonfield. And Corey himself, he becomes evidence that evil in these films isn't just supernatural, it's contagious. Fear creates monsters, isolation creates monsters, and communities create their own boogeyman. So when Corey finally encounters Michael in the sewer, this scene almost plays less like a random meeting and more of like a passing of evil, a transference of evil from one person to another. That's why Halloween Ends feels so tonally different from the other two films. It's quieter, more melancholic, almost weirdly romantic at times. And I think that tonal shift frustrated audiences because the marketing didn't really do this film justice, and is honestly one of my biggest complaints about this film. It sold the movie as a massive final battle between Laurie and Michael, when the actual film is much more interested in asking whether evil truly dies or if it just simply changes shape. Now, does Halloween Ends execute every single one of these ideas perfectly? No. There are absolutely fair criticisms. Michael and Laurie definitely needed more screen time together. Corey's transformation can feel a little abrupt for some viewers. And because this was marketed as the conclusion to a trilogy, I can completely understand why so many fans felt so blindsided by how experimental this movie became. Now look, it does seem like I am throwing some shade at Halloween Ends, and I really do not want to misconstrue how I feel about this movie. I do honestly love Halloween Ends. I respect so much about it. So in defense of Halloween Ends, I wanted to just comment on some of the things that I actually do really like. Before I get into that though, I would just like to make a quick comment that while I do love this movie and I love this trilogy, I will say that if this movie was a standalone, I probably wouldn't like it as much. I think this movie really does benefit while being part of the trilogy. If you watch all three movies back to back to back, I think you get so much more value out of all three of them, including Halloween Ends. But I will not deny that if you just watched Halloween Ends as just a throw-on Halloween movie, I can really understand why this is a lot of people's, least favorite film in the franchise, or the most controversial, or the most divisive, or the one that they just don't want to ever revisit. I know the story can feel very mismanaged, especially if you watch it by itself, and oftentimes even when you watch it with the other two films, but even if someone completely hates the story decisions in Halloween Ends, I think it's hard to deny the amount of craftsmanship on display throughout this film. Because from a filmmaking perspective, this might actually be the most visually atmospheric movie of the entire trilogy. The cinematography in Halloween Ends feels noticeably different from 2018 and Kills. Those films often feel tense and immediate, especially Kills, which is very chaotic and aggressive with its pacing and lighting, but Ends feels very cold, much colder, quieter, even more melancholic than the other two films. There's this constant sense of decay hanging over the entire movie. The lighting is softer and darker, Haddonfield almost feels empty at times, and the camera lingers on moments much longer than the audience probably expected after Kills. Even extremely simple scenes like Corey and Allison just walking through town, or Laurie sitting alone in her house, they carry this kind of strange sadness underneath them. And I think that visual approach is very intentional. This movie isn't trying to feel like a non-stop slasher. It's trying to feel like the aftermath of one. Even Michael Myers himself is framed differently. In previous films, Michael often dominates the frame with an unstoppable force. In Ends, he's usually hidden in the darkness, weakened, almost ghost-like. Less a physical monster and more of a lingering shadow. And then there's this incredible soundtrack. John Carpenter, Cody Carpenter, and Daniel Davis absolutely killed this soundtrack once again. In all honesty, this is probably my favorite score out of all three films. But unlike Kills, which had this loud, pounding, aggressive energy to many of its tracks, the music in Halloween Ends feels so much more haunting and emotional. There's a synth cue that throughout the film just constantly plays. It feels so tragic rather than terrifying. And this synth cue is especially noticeable during the Corey scenes. The soundtrack constantly reinforces this feeling that the film is less about pure horror and more about emotional deterioration. Even the quieter piano elements layered into certain tracks give this film a reflective tone that feels very different from the rest of the trilogy. I think the score is a huge reason why the atmosphere for Halloween Ends works so much for me as it does. Because even when the narrative takes risks that may or may not work for everybody, the film never feels lazy or cynical, at least not to me. There is a genuine artistic identity behind it. The cinematography, the pacing, the music, they all support this idea that Halloween Ends is meant to feel like a ghost story about a town rotting from unresolved trauma. Which again is probably why the movie resonates so strongly with some people and completely alienates others. While I admire a lot of what Halloween Ends attempts thematically, the criticisms surrounding the film are completely understandable. The biggest issue is that the movie was marketed as a final Laurie Strode versus Michael Myers showdown, but instead shifts much of its focus into Corey Cunningham, a brand new character introduced into the trilogy's final chapter. For many viewers, that felt jarring and disconnected from what they were expecting emotionally and narratively. The film's slower, more character-driven pacing also clashed heavily with the brutal, non-stop chaos that was Halloween Kills. And on top of all of that, Michael Myers himself is portrayed as older, weaker, and more withdrawn, which some audiences viewed as thematically interesting, while others saw it as inconsistent with the other previous films. Even ideas conceptually, like Corey's tragic descent, can feel rushed in execution. Ultimately, a lot of the backlash comes from the tension between what the film intended to be and what the audiences were promised, but at the same time, I can genuinely respect how ambitious this film is. Because in an era where so many legacy sequels play everything so safely, Halloween Ends took a massive swing, for better or worse. And even if that swing doesn't fully work for everyone, I think there's far more thematic substance beneath the surface than the film usually gets credit for. When you really step back and look at Halloween Ends in the context of the entire trilogy, I think it becomes pretty clear that this movie is trying to complete thematic ideas that began all the way back in Halloween 2018. Because from the very beginning, these films were never just asking, how do you kill Michael Myers? I think a better question to ask these films is, what does evil do to people over time? In Halloween 2018, we see trauma on an individual level through Laurie Strode. One night in 1978 completely reshaping her identity. Her fear isolated her from her family, consumed her life, and transformed her into someone incapable of truly moving on. Then, in Halloween Kills, that trauma spreads outward onto the town itself. Haddonfield becomes paranoid, angry, self-destructive. Fear turns into hysteria, and the town creates its own chaos trying to destroy the very evil that it fears. And finally, with Halloween Ends, is where those ideas finally evolve into something even darker. Because now the question becomes, what happens to the people left behind after the fear settles in permanently? Not everyone becomes a Laurie Strode. Not everyone becomes a survivor. Some people break. That is Corey Cunningham. And what makes Corey interesting to me is that he's essentially the product of everything this trilogy has been building towards since 2018. He's not evil in the same way Michael is evil. He starts as a completely normal person, absolutely destroyed by tragedy, isolation, and the judgment of the entire community that already needs a new boogeyman. Haddonfield creates Corey almost as much as Michael does. That's why this film constantly parallels them visually and emotionally. Corey becomes this distorted reflection of what trauma can turn someone into when they're consumed by shame, anger, and alienation. And I think that's the real thematic purpose behind Michael's reduced role in this film. Michael Myers is no longer just a man in Ends. He becomes an idea, a lingering infection underneath Haddonfield itself. Even when he's barely on screen, his presence has poisoned the entire town. People are now crueler, more cynical, more emotionally detached. The violence from Halloween 2018 and Kills didn't just disappear when Michael vanished, it changed the emotional DNA of the community itself. That's why Laurie feels so different in this film too. For the first time in the trilogy, Laurie is actually trying to heal. She's writing memoirs, rebuilding her relationships, and attempting to live a normal life. And I think that contrast is incredibly important, because Laurie represents someone attempting to process trauma. Corey represents someone consumed by it, and Allison is caught directly between these two paths, which honestly makes Halloween Ends feel less like a traditional slasher movie and more like a story about cycles. Cycles of violence, cycles of fear, cycles of emotional inheritance. This trilogy begins with Laurie trapped in the past, and it ends with Laurie finally choosing to let go of it. That's why the final procession through Haddonfield matters so much. It isn't just about destroying Michael physically, it's a symbolic closure. The town collectively confronting decades of fear and finally forcing themselves to move on. Whether the execution fully works for everyone is obviously subjective, but thematically, I genuinely think Halloween Ends is far more consistent with the ideas this trilogy was exploring from the beginning than most people initially gave it credit for. And so, that is what I think that's ultimately why I find David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy so fascinating to revisit. Not because every creative choice works, not because every criticism is wrong, but because beneath all of the division, all the discourse, and all the arguments about Corey Cunningham or Evil Dies Tonight, there's a trilogy that was genuinely trying to explore something bigger than just Michael Myers stalking babysitters for 3 movies straight. At its core, this trilogy is about what fear does to people and trauma. How trauma reshapes identity, how violence echoes across generations, how communities create monsters just as much as the monsters terrorize those communities. And whether you think Halloween Ends succeeds or fails, I honestly believe it completes the thematic arc these films were building towards since the very beginning. Halloween 2018 asked how someone can survive evil. Halloween Kills asks what happens when fear consumes an entire community. And Halloween Ends asks whether people can ever really truly move on from what they fear, or whether it simply transforms into something new. That doesn't mean everyone has to love these movies, but I think they do deserve more credit for taking risk in a genre, and especially a franchise, that often survives off repeating itself endlessly. Because years later, people are still debating these films, still analyzing them, and still arguing about them. And honestly, I think that says something. Maybe David Gordon Green's trilogy wasn't the Halloween story everyone wanted, but I do think it was a story that had something to say. So when I look back at David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy now, I don't really see a perfect trilogy. I see an ambitious one that I personally love. A trilogy that started as a grounded legacy sequel that slowly turned into something stranger, messier, and far more thematic than I think most of the audience was really expecting. And while that evolution absolutely alienated most of the fan base, it is also the reason why these movies are continued to be talked about today. Because whether you like these films or not, they definitely had an impact. Halloween 2018 absolutely reminded audiences why Michael Myers is so terrifying. Halloween Kills turned fear into hysteria and absolute chaos. And Halloween Ends dared to be different. It dared to ask the question whether evil is even supernatural, or if it's just something that people create and pass on to others. And while I can absolutely understand all the criticisms this entire trilogy has, each individual movie having its own problems, I can honestly respect that they took such a bold swing with all three movies in three completely different ways. And even if those risks don't fully land, I think they're memorable. And me personally, as a horror movie fan and as a film lover, I will take something that is trying to be more ambitious over something that's just safe and forgettable any day of the week. But, of course, this is just my personal interpretation of this entire trilogy. Maybe you think Halloween Ends ruined the entire trilogy. Maybe you think Halloween Kills is the strongest of all three. Or maybe you're like me and you feel like all three of these movies have been kind of misunderstood ever since they released. Whatever your opinion may be on all three of them, I would love to hear what you think about it. So let me know down in the comments, do you think David Gordon Green's Halloween trilogy is misunderstood, or do you think that all the criticism that it's had over all these years is completely justified and you just don't like them? Thank you so much for joining me on this Halloween trilogy retrospective journey. It has been an absolute blast recording this and kind of going through these films again. I love these movies and I love to talk about movies. So, thank you for watching and stay spooky.